Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We're on page 13, top of 1362. So now, each of the last paragraphs covered another aspect of the Nekuda of Malchus. First, it began on page 1355, just to lay out a general outline here, where he began with that Malchus is Netzal, emanated originally in Beseid Shedish, in its root core, what he calls Nekuda Hashroshis, as a Nekuda, a point. That point is a state of concealment relative to, let's say, Zah, which is its contrast to Eira Mashpia, that emanate with 6 facets, Vov Ktsavis, that encompass the seven lower emotions. Okay, the 7 lower spheres, I should say. And there the Tosfos is the Gimel Rishenis of Mochin. So that began on page 1357. And he explained that this Nekuda is rooted in Radla, Reshid Le'isyad, and Atik, and all the way in Atzmus Ein Sof, Helama Atzmi. And that's why it doesn't come in the form of expression, because it's rooted in a place that's beyond expression. Shcheirani, I am dark. Now, in the next paragraph, at the bottom of 1358, he explained, now it's certain that Malchus, even as a Nekuda, also has a Eir and a Keli. And this paragraph was concerned with how do you explain that? So he explained the Eir is a Eir la'atzma. It's only an energy for its own needs, like a nursing child that's only able to receive the Eir. So there is Eir, but it's all in a receptive mode, absorbing. Or as he explained afterwards, Aliyah is skalalus. When you're busy absorbing, you can't be busy exuding. So it's in a state of complete absorption, of being encompassed in its source. Whereas Zah, even though it also has a bittel, and also an element of absorbing the higher levels, as he explained in the 2 parentheses on page 1359, but nevertheless, it also manifests as a mashpia. And ultimately, its absorption is different because there it's more to receive from its source. It's not about being encompassed in the source, which is the utter bittel of Malchus. Okay. As he explained in the parentheses, the middle of the page 1359, that the Gimel Rishenis of Zah are in a state of lemivla, absorbing, but the Zayin Tachtenis are about mashpia. That's what Zah is about, is a mashpia. Okay. The next paragraph, which is on page 1360, goes back now. Okay, says that's the Nekuda of Malchus. But how about the structure of Malchus? We know that Malchus is necessary to draw down Atzilus into Biyah, because Atzilus on its own, without the filter or the channeling of Malchus, or to put it in simple English, sunlight on its own is too bright for this earth. So we need moonlight. We need Malchus. So Malchus needs to be built up, because at this point, Nekuda is only absorbing. It's not transmitting. Like we said, the example of the child, the example of the person who's beginning to study something, they only understand the basics, they can't yet communicate it to another. So it's all absorbing more. So now we need Malchus to be built up to become a mashpia. And that's the Tosfos, the say Tosfos, not the Shedish anymore. We're now talking about building out Malchus. So going back to the Pri-Eitz Chaim and to the Shara Kavonis, as he cited back on top of page 1358, and then returns to it on 1360. So the name of the Ramaz, it says that Shcheirani, I'm dark, but Venova, but beautiful, I'm beautiful. What's the beauty? Because Malchus has the capacity to be built up and to rise in stature. Lamed Tomid Ponim Im Hazah. It's able to also, in other words, stand at the same level like Zah, and that's the building up of the Eira Makabel of the Nekuda of Malchus, that it should also be able to transmit. And then he went on to explain first the Kabbalistic language that Nikud of Malchus goes down at night into Biyah. Then in the morning it elevates all the way to the chest, Chazei de Zah, receiving a trace of the Mochin of Malchus, the Mochin of Zah, drawing down the difference between Tefillin Shal Rosh, Tefillin Shal Yad, and Tefillin Shal Rosh, which is these two levels of Mochin. Like he explained, whether it's Yediyah Klolis, just a general awareness of the divine, or Yediyah Pratis, where you come down into details, it's Tefillin Shal Rosh. That's why there's four boxes, four compartments, I should say. Or the second interpretation, that the first, that Tefillin Shal Yad, which corresponds to the heart, to the chest, is the divine as it relates to existence, and Tefillin Shal Rosh is divine beyond existence, Das Elyon, the transcendent energy. That's the explanation of the Priyatz Chaim of the Arizal. And then comes Omnam, the real full development of Malchus begins in davening, like he said. This just sets the stage, prepares Malchus to be able to receive from Zah and from the higher levels, from the 9 spheres that will build up Malchus to become a Mashpia into Biyah. And then he explains actually that building, that structure, which consists essentially of Keser, Mochin, and Midas. So Keser is the Ratzon to be a king, that Malchus should become the king of Biyah, so to speak, and not just absorbing the higher levels of the divine as it is in the Nekuda. Malchus is not becoming also Mashpia. And more than that, it comes into Mochin, and then it comes into Mochin, the intelligence necessary to govern, and Midas, the empathy and the feelings of the king as he relates to the people. So there's the Malchus b'derech Reichuk and the Malchus b'derech Kiruv, as he explained on page 1361. So the Remes Isnasus is more the king as he's exalted, and the nation stands in awe and reverence of him. And then there's how Malchus, that's more like Kesed. And then there's how the Ratzon Melucha. Then comes how the Melech relates to the people. He's still a Melech, but he relates to them. So that's more b'chinas Kiruv. Ein b'chinas is not Zamulcha, b'chinas Kiruv. Chochma Midas the Malchus, that relate to the specific details and the needs of the nation and the people. Okay. So that explains the binyan of Malchus. But the next paragraph, which we began learning yesterday, which is on the bottom of page 1361 and continues to 1362, addresses now the other side of the coin. Okay, so now we've gone through the Nikud of Malchus, which is just an absorber. We've gone through the Spashus of Malchus, the building of Malchus, the structure, the development of Malchus, which is the 9 spheres in Malchus. So Malchus is now able to go into Biyah. But Malchus is still Malchus. It's still fundamentally a Era Makabel. Even when it's filled up with this energy, he says, in order for it to actually transmit, Malchus still has to be receiving that Eir from higher, from Zah. So even now, even though we've established that Malchus now is being built up, it's no longer just the bitl of Malchus absorbing, but it's also a mashpia, not just a makabel. Even its makabel is also connected to Zah all the time. Meaning, even when the moon is shining at night, that light is also coming from the sun. And as he explained, there are 2 opinions, whether it's completely from the sun and it's just being filtered or so-called being transformed through the moon. So it looks like moonlight, but it's actually sunlight, meaning not sunlight as in daylight, but really light from the sun that's just being so-called traveling through, passing through the moon, or it's actually Oir Atzmo Shalal Levana, that the Levana itself has Oir, but that Oir is not active. It's not an Oir that radiates until the sun triggers something there. So Gam L'Deyazu, even according to the opinion that the Levana itself has a form of light, meaning that Malchus has something, it's still dependent on Zah and on the higher spheres to be able to radiate into Biyah. As he explained at the top of 1362, where we stopped, he says, so, even Dezu, who dafke idea shalvana mekabelis era shemesh, ozi meira. That's when it radiates. Ubetulda, and the example of birthing, which is also used in the Geras HaKedah Simachov, I should have mentioned that. At the bottom of page 1361, he explained that iu v'garmui echad means that garmui goes on Malchus. And let me just see 1 second. Yeah, the Eris and Kalim. The Eris and Kalim hagodl v'agibur. That means that the Kalim constantly need the Eir to shine through them. You need the Kalim because the creation happens through the creative process happens through the containers. But the containers are instruments that need the Eir to shine through them. And that's Beproti Zoh Malchus. So even though it's happening through Malchus, like the growth in the earth, nevertheless, you need the catalyst and the trigger, and so-called what turns on the switch is the Amshacha from Zoh, from Mad, from the Zoh. And the same thing with the moon, and the same thing with birth. So all three things he uses here. The vegetation of the earth that grows from the earth, which is Malchus, Levana, which is Malchus, and birthing also needs the father and the mother. So even though the child develops within the mother, and you must have the mother, which in this case is Malchus, to give birth and conceive a child, but the father, the seed of the father is a part of it and also a catalyst to make it happen. That's where we stopped. So bottom line is that even when Malchus is being mashpia, which means it's now built into Malchus with all its 10 spheres within it, or 9 spheres within it, however you explain it, that too requires a constant steady flow and connection to Zoh. Good. So in a sense, you can say that Malchus has 2 elements of bittul. The bittul of the Nekuda of Malchus, which is completely just an absorber, just absorbing its source, like the student that just in presence and constantly absorbing is, and there's no ashpa altogether there. And even when Malchus is a mashpia, it still retains the bittul because it's receiving the light that is transmitting the melech to biyah from Zoh, from the mashpia. Okay. So that's a summary just to give the whole flow, to get the picture going here. Now, we're going to continue now, the third line on page 1362. Since this is, again, a pretty comprehensive topic, if somebody wants to ask anything, I'm happy to answer any question right now before I read on. Okay. So if you're following along the text, go to ayinbeis.com. There's a PDF of all these pages where you can read. And I'm beginning line 3 on page 1362. V'zehu desira lesla megamo klum. And this is the meaning of the Zohar that he brought earlier. Though in the Zohar earlier he quoted Malchus lesla megamo klum, but sometimes the expression is sira. I think in Zohar it says sira, or maybe I have to look it up. But the Zohar was actually cited initially on the first the first line of the paragraph on page 1357, if you want to see it inside, where he brought the 2 interpretations. So now he's going back to the first interpretation. So this is the meaning that the moon, Lesla, has nothing megarma at all. It has nothing of its own at all. Lesla, megarma on its own, klum, anything. It has nothing of its own. The be'etzem, he bechinas nekuda achas. Going back, because be'etzem Malchus, though it does have the extension and the add-ons that we've included, the 9 spheres that turned it into a full entity with Ratzon, Mochin, Mides, a full-blown entity. But the etzem, and etzem here most likely means similar to shadish. The root, at its root, the etzem, Malchus is a nekuda achas. She bechinas helam. Like we learned earlier, it's a state of concealment, a nekuda. It's just a concentrated point. You don't see any extension, expression. Ubebchinas aliyah v'istalkus. And as we also learned, it's in a state of aliyah v'istalkus, like the flame, because the containers are not nechas. It says it's not contained, it's not controlled, it's not impacted by the containers. So it's in a state of aliyah v'istalkus. That's Malchus be'etzem. And the fact that Malchus does have spheres is benivnis be'eses spheres, me'eses spheres dezah. It's not that Malchus itself, it was built The structure of Malchus, the development of Malchus, came from Zoh. So either way you turn it, Be'etzem on its own, it's an akudah, less lamagamal klum, it has nothing of its own. And also as it's built, and its structure is also not from itself, it's coming from Zoh. The gamla achre, and like we just explained, the gamla achre shenivnis, and even after it's built up, even after Malchus develops into a full entity, in order for there to be the transmission from Malchus to create and to sustain the world, the b'chinas chayes chitzeni. Why is it chayes chitzeni? Because we said Malchus draws it down on a more diminished or external level, the chayes pnimi. Both the chayes chitzeni, both the external, the outer surface level of energy that sustains existence, and the chayes pnimi, and the inner form of energy, ubefrat lias leidus hanashamis mebchinas Malchus. We also know from Malchus comes the birth of the souls that enter into Biyah. Kol zeh hu aidei mekabelas mebchinas Zoh. All this is what is through receiving from Zoh. So he says essentially 3 points. The etzem of Malchus is an akudah, which is concealment and aliyah vistalkos, elevated and being encompassed in its source. The essence spheres within it are built from Zoh, and even after it's built, it still requires the hamshacha from Zoh to be able to transmit and sustain. In other words, cut off Zoh from Malchus, even after Malchus is built up, Malchus will not be able to draw that energy into Biyah. So all this explains why less lamagar maklum. In other words, not just in the beginning, Malchus throughout remains an entity that on its own, it doesn't have anything. Now, he did explain, just to qualify, on top of page 1316, at the end of the paragraph, he did say that when you break it down, based on what we learned, the real meaning of Lesla Megam Klum is not on the Nakuda, because the Nakuda does have something. It's primarily on once Malchus is built up, and Malchus is Mashpia, that's when you say it has nothing of its own. But it's understandable that even that distinction, but generally speaking, the Nakuda is still a Makabel. So it's not a Mashpia. So at the end of the day, Lesla Megam Klum, you could say in general on Malchus, even on the Nakuda, even though when you really break it down, the Rebbe Rashab does make that distinction. Just wanted to explain that it's not a contradiction to what we're learning here. In other words, the Nakuda is an entity. It's just an entity that the energy there is only for its own needs. But there is a Eder Keli, like he explained. So I would say that the primary meaning of Lesla Megam Klum is when Malchus becomes extended, even then it has nothing of its own. But right here, he's really explaining it in general terms, and no matter how you twist it, Malchus, at the end of the day, is not a self-contained entity. It always remains in a state of Lesla Megam Klum. And that's not a weakness. That's the way it was created. Like we learned earlier, that's not due to the diminishment of the moon. That's due to the fact that God wanted to create a Eira Makabel. He said that explicitly. Explicitly, where did he say that? Right here, on page 1355. Even when it's Shnei Me'eres Hagdelim and the moon is in its full intensity, it's still fundamentally a Makabel. And I explained the reason why, because God wanted to implant in Ishtalshlus, in existence, something that is in a state of bittul. If everything was only coming from Zoh, we would see more the focus on our ability to transmit. But we want to also have the element of having bittul in our lives. And that's what Malchus personifies and embodies. Just to bring back that point. Okay. So, back to here.
The bittul is for the purpose that it should be biyah, because without bittul, Zoh cannot create.
Yeah, but the bittul is also for us to be able to have a dugma chaya, an example like a melech, like he explains in Mitzvahs Minei Melech. We should see in our lives, not just what we're able to give, but we're also able, the need to be able to be a chayzer and receive. So Malchus always reminds us of that element of being a complete absorber. Even when you're mashpia, to always know that you're really absorbing and reach and bringing from an under level. There's another part that we need in our lives to be a mashpia, a real mashpia, like Zah. But there's a need to have this element of becoming a makabel, a fundamental makabel, because to make a dira b'tachtenim, you need both things. You need to both contain. You need to get rid of your ego, dissolve your ego, and sublimate it in order to receive the godliness. But you also need to be a mitzias. You need to have an existence. You can't be an eskupa and adresses, a doormat. You need to also have an entity that exists. You're not completely eis mitzias. So therefore, you really need, like there's the Zohar and Malchus and Aveda by each one of us. We have the fundamental state of being a mashpia. We all have something to give. Even that also receives from above. And at the same time, we also have the need to be able to constantly be in a receptive mode, to the point that even when we're mashpia, Malchus, as it goes downward, knows that it's always receiving from that which is higher than it. So it's true. It's true that you need to have on one end Malchus in order to create, as you just said, and to sustain existence, because you need somewhat of a tzimtzum, a concealment, because Zohar itself is too intense, as he explained earlier. Explained that at page 1356. Because it's too much of oir, and Malchus is more of a keli, but I'm explaining it more in Aveda and applying it. Okay. I just wanted to add one thing which I wanted to mention. I think I mentioned it yesterday, but I'll say it again. Very important point. It's not a far stretch to say that the two aspects of Tefillin Shal Yad and Tefillin Shal Rosh, whether it's what he called Yediyah Klolis, like Igulim, just in general terms, or like he said, Yediyah Protis, which is a real full comprehension, or the second explanation, that one is Tefillin Shal Rosh, Tefillin Shal Yad, is Das Tachten, is the divine that relates to existence, and Tefillin Shal Rosh is Das Elyon, which prepares Malchus in the morning, like he said, that Malchus starts elevating, and that is through the Mochin, that it gets both the Mochin of Malchus from Zoh and the Mochin of Zoh from Mochin, from God, from Gimel Rishenis, as he explained. Which prepares it to daven when it builds up. So it's not a far stretch to say, what I wanted to say, was that these two levels are perhaps the two levels in Malchus itself. Remember, Malchus Bekiruv and Richuk. And in a sense, the Reimamus of Malchus is more like the Igulim and the Makif, and the higher, that's more in a state of, that is not as close to us. And the details is when it gets more integrated within us. The same thing, the second interpretation, the transcendent element and the immanent element, or Das Tachten and Das Elyon, can also be seen as the two levels of the Keser within Malchus and the Mochin and Midas within Malchus. I was just thinking about that maybe there's a connection there. He doesn't say it explicitly, but I just thought that may be something to think about. I need to think it through more, but I just wanted to add that before we continued. Actually, I would have to reverse that. Tefillin Shal Yad is closer to us, and Tefillin Shal Rosh is closer to the higher level. So the klolos is tefillin shel yad. The pratis is tefillin shel rosh. Das tachton is tefillin shel yad, and das elyon is tefillin shel rosh. Okay, so those would be the two levels. The Rema Mishisnasis would be more like tefillin shel rosh, and the way it relates to us would be more the Mochin and the Midas. Even though Rema Mishisnasis sounds more like Igulim than Yesher, but that's where it's maybe not completely aligned or consistent to what I just tried to explain. Anyway, just some food for thought. Okay.
I like the way you said it before. Now it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, now I'm confused.
Well, I mean, you could, I don't want to go into it because you can go into a whole pilpul here, just to make it not so confusing. I said it before that way for a reason, because in a certain way, when we recognize God's exaltedness, not how he relates to us personally, but exaltedness, the emes hamelech, as you call it, the reverence. So on one hand, you could say it's more of a rememus, more of a it's distant, and therefore it's more removed from us, so it's more rememus. But on the other hand, it's also a state of what was I going to say?
He's colorless?
No. You're not going to guess the word I was going to say. 1 minute. The reason I thought initially that it's tefillin shel yad is because tefillin shel yad, being that it's a lower level, so we don't fully identify and relate to all the details to all the deeper dimensions of godliness. So that's why all we have is the fear of God that everybody can have. It's when you start relating to God in a deeper way, then it relates more to you. So that's where it gets confusing. Is it more on our terms or more on God's terms? So initially I was thinking that tefillin shel yad only can relate to God from a distance in that sense. And tefillin shel rosh, you're starting to relate in a closer way, in a sense, more pepinimius. But the fact of the matter is, the other way around is also true, because the fact is tefillin shel rosh is what he calls your das elyon. It's God's perspective. And tefillin shel yad is the godliness that relates to us, which sounds very much how Malchus relates to us in the level of Mochin and Midas. So that would sound more like tefillin shel yad. That's why I'm not sure which way to go here. Maybe you could explain it both, or maybe the whole exercise that I just tried is wrong. I'm ready to say that too. I was just trying to see if there's a connection between these two, because it sounds literally one comes one page after the next. It would seem that they're speaking about these two kiruv and richuk. It sounds very much like what he speaks about in the tefillin shel yad and tefillin shel rosh. So maybe we need some more discussion, more thought on the matter.
Rabbi Jacobson, can one say that both are true? One is before prayer and one is after prayer. Can one make that distinction? That, in other words, that both are true. What you said, it's just that before prayer is one aspect, and then after you pray, then it becomes the other realm.
I don't know. Maybe you could maybe say that. I would say more is this: that when we begin our relationship with God, always God is more beyond us. In general, because you're in a simpler level. Malchus doesn't have much yet. So there's a certain element of distance due to our lack of development. But as we grow, two things happen. We relate more to God internally, but we also start recognizing the distance of God in an even deeper level. So if you really want to force it, and I don't want to force it, you could say that both are true. It depends what means the hisnasus and remus. Are we talking hisnasus and remus like a little child that sees an adult and is just in awe? Or is it like an adult that sees the melech and really sees the melech's true das elyon, so to speak? So if you're talking from the first perspective, then it's more tefillin shel yad, recognizes the distance of the divine, but in a very general way. But it's still, if you're talking about what relationship you have with God on a personal level, it's more the godliness that relates to us. And then we see from a distance, there's something completely beyond. Tefillin shel rosh, you've reached a higher level of comprehension. And there, on one hand, you recognize more details about God, therefore it's more internalized. But on the other hand, the Remus Isnasis is also much higher. So maybe that's part of it. But, I think it's enough. I don't want to belabor it. I'm doing what I always say we shouldn't do, which is speculate. I just seemed to jump out at me, the two things, and I was trying to find a way to connect them. I'm not sure if I could or if I can't, but I don't know, I have much more to say than that. Okay, let's bring it back to where we are here. Where we are here is established that the bottom line is, this is the meaning that the moon or Malchus has nothing of its own, because the Nakuda and the building of Malchus, and even after it's built, is all in a state of not having anything of its own. There's just a distinction what that means. The Nakuda is different, obviously, than the others, but either way, even after Malchus is fully built up, it's still dependent on Zah. Kol Zeh Aideh Shemekabelas M'Bchinas Zah. So everything that Malchus is doing in Biyah, or to put it the example of the king, every detail that the king does in governing, in ruling, and being a king over his people, over his nation, over his subjects, is all coming from the energy he received from Zah that is higher than Malchus. Okay, so now the Rebbe Rashab is going to address another issue. Well, it's not another issue. Okay. He says like this. Seemingly, we can ask a question. Let me first give a little introduction. You just said to me that Malchus is this way, less lemagam al klum, which clearly indicates that Zah is not like that. But we learned that Zah is also netzal, only as 6 facets. It's not complete either. So how do we distinguish and say Zah is also dependent on its source to really be a full entity? So he's going to address now the difference between Zah and Malchus, and I see it's very consistent to what he's been doing till now. In the last page, several times he's mentioned in the 2 parentheses, 1 parenthesis in the middle of the page, and both, actually no, not the previous page, I'm sorry. On page 1359, and remember he qualified that even though Zah also receives from higher, but it's still ultimately, fundamentally a mashpia. And that's why it emanates as 6 facets, Vav Ksavis. And he said it again below. He said this too is the difference between Zah and Malchus, that even though Zah also is connected to its source, but it's still in the form of transmission. And he explained that even the Aliyah and Iskalus of Malchus is different than the way Zah reaches out to its source. One is the Mavukish, is because it wants to receive from its source. And Malchus, the Mavukish, is your longing is to become encompassed in the source. So it seems to me that he's now doing the same thing. He's going to qualify the difference between Zah and Malchus in the context of their bittul to that which they receive from above it. So he says like this: V'agam de Zah, and even though Zah also netzal gamkein rak b'vav ksavis, Zah was also not a complete entity. It's only the Gimel Rishenus Kesach Chachma Bina that the Arizal says emanated as a complete entity. But Zah emanated rak b'vav ksavis, 6 facets. Umakabel hamoichin me abba ve'ima. For it to have moichin, because vav ksavis is only chesed word teferes netzach chayid yisayid. For it to receive moichin, we learned, I'm going back to page 1357, he said it clearly, that Zah is netzal b'seit shed b'chinas vav ksavis, agim l'shein is boim by b'seit tesvis And the Gimel Rishonos, Kesach Chachma Bina, come from Mochin, Abba ve'Ima. So Zah also has an element that's not complete until it receives from that which is higher than it, Chachma and Bina. V'nizbar le'il, the Makom Mokum Yesh Mizah B'chinas Gili, Gam Shehu B'katnus. So he's already beginning to explain it, but he's going back and forth here. So this is both an explanation and part of the question. You'll see in a moment what I mean. And we learned earlier that even though Zah is receiving from Chachma and Bina and not from itself, nevertheless, Zah still has Gili in it, where Malchus has no Gili in it. Zah is Gili, even if it's in a state, Gam Kshehu B'katnus. Even when the Amidus are still immature and underdeveloped, are not developed, it's still a form of Gili. Let's read where he said that explicitly. He says it right here. I'm reading on page 1359. He said like this. The ima yes the cotton ain't a melid, and even though as a child cannot give birth, and as we learned, there's still some ashpa. Remember the three levels: ibur, yanika, mochin. So ibur is a state where the child is only receiving. We're talking about a young newborn that only can feed, but does not yet have any conscious ability to express an emotion. Then there's the level of unique, that's ibur, level of unika, where there's already emotions are beginning to be seen. So even though those emotions are not fully developed and fully mature, but to say there's no gili, there is a gili. A 5-year-old, for example, or a 4-year-old can give somebody something. They can share a toy, a candy. They could share something with a friend. So there's some hashpah. It's just not fully as it is in Mochin, which is what the Vav Ksavas get. The Zog receives from Mochin, not Mochin the Yanika, not Mochin the Katnus. There, that is already a mature adult, starting from Bar Mitzvah or Bat Mitzvah, where you start seeing a higher level of cognitive capacity that actually can control emotions and even give birth to emotions. That's a much higher level. Now, this goes back, frankly, to something we learned throughout the beginning of earlier in volume 3. Remember, Ibr, Yunika, Mechem, Mutfe, Murgish, Muskel. So the more we understand that, the more this is understood, because these are really 3 stages where Malchus is the state of the least development. Zah is already 6, at least emotions are there, and there is some ashpah. And then there's Mochin, which is the highest level of development. And then, of course, we learn even higher than that. Remember, Shalach to Shalach Ha'Sa'im, where the emotions send away the mother Bina, which is Revetzes Aleph Rechim, and the Midas catapult Bina to Chachma, and they both gaze at Arich and Atik, the Shin Ayin, the 370 lights, energies, Nahedin, from the Metzach of Arich and Atik, and so on. So that's all as we develop in Aveda, from the early stage. Like I mentioned, Aveda would be like Moida Ani Lefanecha would be Haidah, would be Malchus, Psuka de Zimra would be Zah, and Shema, especially Shemoneh would be Mochin. The same thing in general development of human life. So when a child is in the fetal position in pregnancy, what do you see? The Gemara in Nida says the child is curled up in a fetal position. The head is literally curled up into the heart, into the body, because the Mochin have not yet been developed. So it's not a child that's just lying stretched out. It's in a fetal position because the Mochin are not yet developed. So the physiology of a fetus in the womb is such where you see there's no Mochin. It's primarily behavioral and reflexive. Then when a child is born, the child is no longer in the fetal position immediately. Immediately it still looks a little like that, but then the child begins to expand. So you have there, the emotions are beginning to develop. A child crawls first, does not walk upright. First it crawls. Then it learns to walk upright, and that's when moyach is higher than the midas, which are then higher than the behavioral. So you have Mochin, you have Chabad, Chagas, Nehi in the right order, Reish, Guf, Regel. But a child, before they begin to walk, are either lying, what do we say, when someone's just lying down in a lying position, or they are crawling. The fetal position, the Mochin is even actually curled up into the body of the child. So all this reflects the development in Aveda, where we begin first on a behavioral reflexive level, which is more Malchus. Then we grow into some emotions, and there is some ashpah, like he says, some gili, even if it's b'chinas katnus, even if it's still immature, but you could educate a child. That's called chinuch. You can't educate a newborn yet, at least not in a direct fashion, that they'll understand what you're doing or saying. And then comes the maturity process, which also begins at 12 and 13 until age 20, as we learned earlier in volume 3. So bringing it back to what we're learning now, he's saying that though Zah is also emanates in its root, only has 6 facets, and it needs Mochin from Chacham and Bina, but still, like we learned, Kol Mokim, he said, Yesh mezabchin is gili gamshu bekatnus. Umakol Mokim, and yet, even though that's true, like we learned earlier, remember we said cotton ain't a melid. So even though a cotton kid could be mashpia, a child can share something with another. A child can also educate someone else on a minimal level, but a child can't give birth to another child. There's an age that even though the sexual organs are there, a child is not capable of giving full birth. Like he said, Eina Melid. So he says, a little laden is a little hasgalus of there can be. Some ashpa there can be za even without Mochin. We're talking about not Mochin dianika. We're talking about without Abba ve'ima, without Chacham and Bina. But to have a real laden mamish to give birth, the child has to grow into somewhat of at least older. So Zog cannot give birth in the full sense of the word until it receives from Mochin of Abba Vima and matures to that level. So in Zog itself, bottom line, you have stages. There's the stage that there's Hashpah, even on a minimal scale, and then for it to really have birth, it needs to be developed, and that's why it's only Vav Ksavis, because it needs the Mochin b'sei Tesis to add to it, to allow it to give birth, like he writes in Eitz Chaim, which is from the Arizal, in a number of discourses or places. So what does this mean? So he continues. Hine bezah b'chinas shleimus. So bezah now is coming to a state of shleimus. Shetzorech liyas nifshel b'chinas haMochin. I'm not sure what he means with b'chinas shleimus, whether he means shleimus that it's more complete than Malchus is, or does he say that Zah is reaching a state of shleimus? I think he means that when Zah is able to give birth, it's in a state of shleimus. It needs for it to be complemented and be completed in the level of Mochin that it does not have on its own.
Like he said, that Malchus is not having it, even when Nigdal.
Yeah, he's going to say that next line, right? I'm just trying to read it once. I'm just making it bizarre. Okay, so he's saying, so Zah has an element of what it has, and it needs Mochin. But once Mochin comes into it, and it grows and matures, and it gets completed with Mochin, it has now the power to give birth, Hilada and Gili. Zoh does. Mashenke b'chinas Malchus. By contrast, level of Malchus, Gam kishenigdelas v'nishlemes b'chinas Mochin. Even after it matures, after it grows and matures, and gets nishlemes, gets complete, the Nakuda of Malchus now is also receiving the spheres. All the way to b'chinas Mochin, tzricha lekabel mizah l'tzedach hashpah v'agili. Malchus, on the other hand, even when it's built up, it still needs Zah in order to be able to be mashpia and to be able to transmit, and in order to become revealed. So Zah needs Mochin in order to be complete in being able to give birth. But once it does have it, it itself is complete. It's now a mashpia. Malchus has never become a mashpia, basically. Even when it's built up and developed, it still remains Malchus and still needs Zah. Where Zah does not need seemingly Mochin to be able to be a mashpia. It needs it to grow into becoming a mashpia. But once it's a mashpia, it's a mashpia. And Malchus always will need Zah. That's what he's apparently saying. So that's a distinction between Zah and Malchus. Let's continue. I know this needs more explanation, but you know what? I think we should stop actually. I'll go a few more minutes. I started late. And this is like, for example, Tachar v'nukva, a male and female, lamato. Basically, husband and wife, a male and female below. The cotton enemeled acher nishlam b'chinas hamechin. A child cannot give birth until he has a certain level, he reaches a certain level of maturity, Mochin, that allows him to give birth. But once he's developed and matured and he has that Mochin, he has actual ability to give birth. He doesn't have to keep going back to the mouth of the well to receive the power to give birth. He's matured. And now he is a mature person. I mean, he is also she. We're talking about both male and female have reached a maturity where now they are able to give birth. However, when it comes to the male, he needs to have a keli.
The nukwa is not having the koach ha'ilada be'atzmo. Only the Zah.
Yeah, that's what it looks like he's going to say. Yeah. So he says, "Yes, but actually, tzarich keli hu atipus man mayim nukvin shebezeh tzir avlad." In other words, the male himself has now has the cotton who's able to give birth, can't give birth without a keli. So he needs to have the keli of the nukva, of the woman, the tipus man, of mayim nukvim, the female feminine energies and waters, shebezeh tzir avlad. With that will create the shaping and the forming and crafting of a child. Mashenken hanukva, by contrast, the nukva malchus, gam kishenishlemes b'chinas Mochin, even when she becomes in the state of Mochin, she becomes mature enough. The ruya loheled, and is capable of giving birth. Srichim le'erer b'koyach ha'ilada. It needs to be aroused, it needs to be stimulated, it needs a catalyst to trigger in her the power to give birth. The lo yeh ma'atzmei, and will not happen on its own. Only through the mayin tchurin, only through the tipa, the seed, the drop from the mayin tchurim, tchura, which is the male seed, the male waters, so to speak, of the male side, from the male. This is interesting because how do we explain? Let me continue reading. Let me finish reading and then we'll discuss it. So he's distinguishing, they both need each other. Obviously, no child can be conceived without a father and a mother. He's distinguishing the difference that the father has the power to give birth, but he needs the female in order for it to be actualized. And the female, even though she has the power to give birth, and it's within her that power, it needs the catalyst of the seed. But the thing is, a woman is not just in a passive state. As a matter of fact, okay, you know what? And even though the giving birth on the female level is with her own power, it's not like someone else's power. She's not just a carrier. It's not just the father is providing everything, and the woman is just simply like a receptacle. She herself is giving birth. The child, the very existence of the child, is coming from the seed, from the drop of the mayin nukvim, of the woman's egg. He doesn't say the word the egg, but basically the man, Allah's man, the man. Vihi amelida. And that she is giving birth. A woman, when she will what's the word? When she will conceive and give birth. So it doesn't say ish, isha kisazriya v'yolda. L'kol mokim, nevertheless, zo idea tchar dafke. It doesn't happen unless there is the seed of the male that triggers that. So it's happening within her, and it's her own power. But in reality, it cannot happen without the male. So that means that Malchus always needs Zah to give birth. Zah also needs Malchus to give birth. But Zah's power, the seed that is there, the male seed, does not need the woman to have the power to give birth. It needs the woman to actually give birth. Whereas the woman to actually give birth needs the seed to be the catalyst. That looks like what he's saying here. Like he writes in Teira Er, B'dibra Maskul Elu Tel Des Yitzchak, V'ayim Mashakoseh Ba'agos L'Sham B'Sefer Tofresh Teiv. The Maimet Elu Tel Des Yitzchak, and the Hagos of the Tzemach Tzedek, Sefer Tofresh Teiv would be the Sefer of the year, Tofresh Yud Zayin, which is Teiv. Tofresh Teiv, Tes Vav Beis is Yud Zayin. It's one of the ways that these bichlach, these are manuscripts. So he's referring to a book of a manuscript which by now has been printed, and I want to look it up what it says there, because it may help illuminate to shed some light on what he just explained. Now the truth is, this was all said actually earlier as well, when he spoke about if you go back, he spoke about this with Isha Kisazriya. I think at the bottom of page 1352. Yeah. So in other words, what the woman does what Malchus does for Zah is allows the creative process to be manifest and actually happen. But what Zah does for Malchus, it gives it's the catalyst that allows that triggers and essentially switches on the power to give birth. But why can't you say the opposite as well? Why don't you say that Malchus also triggers the Koyach HaYiloda in the male? That's what I'm not clear about. Okay. That's my question that's hanging here.
He said that the Tiba Saman is Tzio Havlan. It's not create the Hoylode. The Tiba Saman is Mitzayah Havlan.
Well, would this be also consistent with the way we understand it today? As he doesn't refer, for example, to the ovary, to the woman's egg that she provides. yes, it's fertilized by the seed, but the egg also has genetic material. It's not like we said on top of the page. The woman
Yes, exactly.
provides-
There's parthenogenesis among certain animals, and I'm sure it could be, and maybe even people where there's no father, but within the female is everything, and that could explain some of these questions.
No, but regardless, even if a woman has everything, she still needs something to trigger, whether it's artificial insemination or not. It's
No
still
artificial insemination, nothing to do with any zero or sperm cells, anything like this. And they do it consistently with certain animals, and it's probably been done someplace, maybe in
So
China.
you're asking a question now, but they do something. Something is done. It doesn't just happen. That's the point. Forget about what's done. But it's not just a woman is just going to be sitting alone and suddenly conceive of a child.
But with one animal in particular, it does not happen in nature a lot, and that's a rabbit.
A rabbit without a male, without any partner, without any act, nothing, just suddenly gives birth.
Maybe she smells a male in the air. Who knows what she does? But
No. Okay, so we need to look into it, but I don't think it just happens out of the
okay,
blue.
look up parthenogenesis. That's the word.
Fine, but anyway, that's not what I'm addressing right now. I'm asking that I understand clearly. It's understood. Let's talk in humans. That for to be a child, you need to have both. The question is, is not the question. Malchus needs Zah is very clear, but Zah also needs Malchus. Question is for what purpose? Is it just? It's definitely not just a container, like we just said. It's not just someone delivering the mail, basically. It definitely. But he also said clearly that she herself gives birth. It's not just, yes, Siyur Havlad, but the Siyur Havlad has both aspects from father and mother. They both provide genetic material. So I think what he wants to say, he's not trying to say here that Zah doesn't need Malchus to give birth. He's saying that Zah is the power, the seed has the power. Once it's received Mochin, the father does not have to keep getting mature again every time to be able to provide the seed. That's what he wants to say here. Where Malchus needs all the time the seed of Zah. That's the key thing he wants to say. That's very clear to me. I'm just wondering whether the fact that the woman provides the egg, and the woman, not just that she's the Keli, like he says, that also, even though she provides genetic material, but it doesn't change what I just said. I think that's the vart here. Zah does not need to carry a child. The male is never the one that gets pregnant, and is never the one that gives birth directly anyway. That's only Malchus. That's why the creation of Biyah has to come through Malchus. Zah cannot give birth on its own, but Zah has a power to give birth once it matures to a certain point. So the interesting irony is that even though creation happens only through Malchus, but Malchus always needs the catalyst of Zah to trigger it. That's what he's saying. Okay, that's the pshat here. I think that what I just said now is what he's wanting to say. He's not coming to negate the role of the woman here. On the contrary, he's just trying to explain that Malchus has these two sides. On one hand, it's the one that gives birth. Isha kisazriya doesn't say ish. Isha kisazriya, she gives birth, she conceives, she gives birth to the child. But in order for that to happen, you need Zah. Even though it's a mature woman who has Mochin and everything. Zah, until it has Mochin, can't even conceive of a child. The seed of a child will not give birth to anything. It's not yet at a stage where it can give birth.
Not because of the cotton, because he needs the Malchus. He needs the nukva.
Right, exactly. But I'm saying a child before he gets Mochin he's not even in a cotton and a melech. Once he gets Mochin, he now has the capacity, but he needs Malchus to actually give birth. Malchus, even after it's mature and has the capacity to give birth, still needs the catalyst of Zah. That's the point here. Yeah.
Lo
Okay.
What does it mean by Malchus? Lo but Malchus is giving. Nukva is giving. He's talking about Nukva.
If you took the seed of a man and put it into the ground, it's not going to give birth to a child, right? because the woman has the power to give birth. She is the power of birth, comes from a mother, not from a father. But the triggering, the actual getting the conception to conceive of a child and the birth of a child requires the catalyst. You need like this, the moon gives off light, but it's the sun that triggers that to give off the light. The moon itself gives the light. The mother itself will give birth. The mother is not just a shliach or a messenger or a carrier of the fathers. She herself gives birth, but for it to actually happen, you need zaz, hashpa, the like he says, they say to this, to me it's clear. Okay.
That's what he said.
Okay, so I think that's the clear picture here. Does anyone have any questions?
I always thought when they said these pasukim about whether it's a boy or a girl, and it has to do with the menstrual cycle, and you know, that's what they were talking about. And and who has the mitzvah of peru? Men only, or is it also women?
Which mitzvah? The mitzvah of what? Having children?
Peru.
Well, there's already explanations. The Ran explains why. Because a man, if he wasn't commanded, he wouldn't do it, and a woman would do it naturally. Yeah.
I have a question.
It's exactly like it is. It's just like it is. If it rains on a table, nothing's going to grow. On the earth, the earth makes things grow. God planted Teitzi Eretz Desha on the third day of creation. He gave the earth the power to produce vegetation. But in order for that to happen, it needs rain. But it's not the rain that gives birth. It's the earth that gives birth. But it needs rain to generate, to trigger, to turn on the switch of the Haylada within Malchus, within Aretz. Yeah. Okay, yeah, go ahead. What's your question?
Sorry, I had to unmute. Maybe tangentially related, but it's really Chazara. In the binyan of Malchus is the building up of Mochin of Malchus coming directly from Chabad of Atzilus, or is it coming through Zah?
Everything seems to come through Zah. Before we learned, there's derech maiver, there's derech hislapshus. In the early stages, for sure, it comes through Zah. Remember, we discussed about the different stages of Aliyas HaMalchus. If I recall, he said the following, going back quite a while back. Remember, he said that in the beginning of creation, Malchus receives, there was one keser for both Malchus and Zah, for Zah and Malchus. They both received from Teferes of Bina, right? However, it traveled through Zah, the derech maiver, in passing. La'asad lave, Malchus will receive it directly from Bina without passing through Zah. So it depends which stage you're talking. If you're talking during after the diminishment of the moon, it's receiving it through Zah, b'derech hislapshus. That's what we learned. So there's basically the answer is, for all practical purposes, the way we're talking now, the way Malchus develops, is through Zah. Question is whether it's in passing through Zah or b'derech hislapshus through Zah. But then, after all the avodah, Malchus will be able to receive straight from Mochin without Zah.
Okay, thank you.
I believe that's what we learned. I'm trying to see where that was. That was, yeah, on page 1355. And going back to the beginning of this volume, page 1209. If you look there, that's where he spoke about it. Yeah.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you
very
again.
clear. Yeah. Okay. So we'll stop here. End of the paragraph on page 1360.